My daughter's fiance looked me up and down in front of 40 guests and said, "Is that suit from a thrift store?" I didn't realize we were letting in charity cases tonight. For 3 full seconds, nobody in that ballroom moved. The string quartet in the corner kept playing, some slow waltz nobody was listening to anymore, the notes drifting out over glasses that had all stopped halfway to people's mouths. A waiter froze mid-step with a tray of champagne flutes tilting dangerously in his hand. Somewhere behind me I heard the small, sharp click of a woman's heel shifting her weight, the only sound in a room that had gone completely silent except for that violin, still playing, oblivious, into the wreckage. I stood there in my $40 suit, the one I'd worn to my wife's funeral 12 years earlier and every important occasion since, and I felt exactly the way an old pocket watch feels when someone decides it isn't worth winding anymore. Not broken, just set aside. That's the kind of thing you notice when you've spent your whole life repairing things other people threw away. My name is Walter Hutchins. Before you hear anything else about me, you should know that 10 minutes after that comment, a man worth more money than most countries walked through those double doors, looked across a room full of the wealthiest people in 3 states, and called me Dad. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, we tell true stories about ordinary people who get pushed to their breaking point by the very families they gave everything to build. Stick around, because tonight's story is one I still think about, long after I finished writing it down. Let's get into it. I'm 64 years old. I've spent 41 of those years behind the same scarred wooden counter in a watch repair shop on Maple Street, in a small Vermont town called Ashbury Falls. Population just under 6,000. The kind of place where everybody still waves at everybody else's truck, even if they can't remember the driver's name. My father opened that shop in 1958. I inherited it, along with his tools, his loop, and his stubborn belief that anything broken deserves a chance before you decide it's garbage. I want to be honest with you about something before I go any further, because this story only makes sense if you understand what kind of man I actually am. Not the version people assume when they see a 64-year-old widower in a cheap suit standing alone at a party full of important people. I am not a brave man. I never have been. I don't say that with false modesty. I say it because it matters later. Big rooms full of people who all seem to know each other. Rooms where everyone is watching everyone else. Rooms like the one I was standing in that night. Those rooms have never been kind to me. My hands shake in them. Not a little. My fingers start trembling somewhere around the second or third minute of forced small talk, and I have to press them flat against my thighs to make it stop, and if that doesn't work, I find myself pulling at my shirt cuffs, straightening them again and again, a habit my late wife Margaret used to gently tease me about, back when she was the only person who could pull me through a crowded room without my chest going tight. I've had that habit since I was 9 years old, since a Christmas Eve when my own father stood me up in front of relatives and told them, laughing, that I was too slow and too soft to ever amount to a real man's trade, that fixing tiny gears was women's work. He said it like a joke. Nobody in that room laughed the way you laugh at a joke. They laughed the way people laugh when they don't know what else to do with the silence. I was 9. I remember exactly where I was standing. I remember exactly what my hands did. They haven't fully stopped doing it since, not in rooms like that one. I tell you this now, at the start, because I don't want you thinking this is a story about some fearless old man who marched into a ballroom and set the world straight with a clever line. That's not what happened. What happened is a lot messier and a lot more human, and it started 3 months before that party, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, with a phone call from a man I'd worked with for almost 20 years. His name is Dale Pruitt. He used to be my apprentice, back when he was 19 and had more energy than sense, and now he ran his own small appraisal business, 2 towns over, valuing antiques and estate jewelry for insurance companies. Dale still stopped by my shop most Tuesdays for coffee, the same way he had for 2 decades, and that particular Tuesday he came in looking like a man carrying something he didn't want to be carrying. "Walter," he said, setting his cup down without drinking from it, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to not get upset with me for asking it." I told him to go ahead. I remember the shop smelled like it always did. Machine oil and old brass and the faint cedar of the display cases my father built by hand. Emily came to see me last week, he said. About your building. My daughter Emily is 34 years old. She is, by every measure the world uses, a success. She works in wealth management at a firm 2 hours south, in Burlington, wears clothes I don't have names for, and drives a car that costs more than I made in my first 5 years running the shop. When her mother died, Emily was 22, freshly out of college, and for the first year afterward, it was just the two of us in that house, learning how to grieve in the same rooms without stepping on each other's silence. I remember thinking, back then, that we had built something unbreakable out of that loss. I remember being wrong. What about my building? I said to Dale, though something in my stomach had already gone cold and tight, the way it does right before you drop a fragile mechanism and know, half a second before it hits the floor, exactly what's about to happen. Dale told me Emily had come to his office asking him to do an informal appraisal of the Maple Street property. My shop, the building my father built, the one with our family's name still carved into the cornerstone above the door. Not for insurance. She'd been vague about the reason, he said, but she'd specifically asked what a downtown parcel that size might be worth to a commercial developer, and whether corner lots on that block had been selling for redevelopment lately. I want to tell you I got angry right then. I didn't. I did what I always do when something threatens to knock me sideways. I made an excuse for her before she'd even asked to be excused. She's probably just curious, I told Dale, thinking about the future. People do that. Dale looked at me the way you look at an old friend who's about to walk into traffic. Maybe, he said. I just thought you should know. That phrase would come back to haunt me more than once over the following weeks. I just thought you should know. People kept saying it to me, one after another. Small warnings dropped like breadcrumbs. I was too afraid to follow. Here's what you need to understand about the months leading up to that ballroom. Nothing about it looked like a conspiracy. Nothing about it looked like betrayal. It looked like a wedding. 6 months earlier, Emily had gotten engaged to a man named Preston Ashford III, and yes, that Ashford, of Ashford Development Partners, the real estate firm whose name you'll find stamped on half the luxury condominium buildings and boutique hotels that have gone up across 3 states in the last decade. Preston's father, Bradford Ashford, built that company from a single strip mall in the 80s into an empire, and everyone in our part of Vermont knew the name the way you know the weather. Preston himself was polished, in the way expensive things are polished. Charming at dinner parties, quick with a compliment, and utterly incapable, I would come to learn, of an original thought that didn't originate first in his father's mouth. When Emily first brought him home to meet me, I tried. I want that on the record. I shook his hand. I asked him about his work. I nodded along when he explained things to me slowly. The way you explain things to someone you've already decided won't understand them. I told myself that was just how successful young men from successful families carried themselves. I told myself Emily loved him, and that was enough, and that a father's job wasn't to approve of every choice his daughter made, but to stand beside her while she made it. I believed that, mostly, right up until the week of the engagement party. The party itself had been Bradford Ashford's idea, thrown at his estate outside Burlington, a house so large it had its own name, Thornacrest, like it was a small country instead of a building. 200 guests. A tent with chandeliers hanging from the ceiling like something out of a magazine I'd never buy. Emily had called me twice in the week beforehand to remind me about the dress code, and something in her voice, both times had sounded less like excitement and more like management, like she was handling a difficult client, rather than inviting her own father to celebrate her. I didn't understand why until Dale called me again, 4 days before the party, sounding worried in a way I'd rarely heard from him. Walter, he said, I need you to listen to me carefully, and I need you to actually listen this time, not make excuses. I sat down at my workbench. I remember exactly what I was working on. A 1960s Belova, with a hairline crack in the crystal, belonging to a woman named Ruth Callahan, whose late husband had worn it every day of their 40-year marriage. I remember setting my loop down very slowly, because some part of me already knew I wasn't going to want my hands to be doing anything delicate for the next few minutes. I did some digging, Dale said. Not because I don't trust Emily. Because I love you both, and something about that conversation with her never sat right with me. She wasn't just asking about property values, Walter. She met with a lawyer 2 weeks ago. An elder law attorney, out of Montpelier. I know because his office called mine afterward, asking for an official appraisal to attach to a filing. What kind of filing? I said, though I think I already knew. The way you know a storm is coming from the particular color the sky turns before the first drop falls. A guardianship petition, Dale said quietly. For incapacity. Walter, I think your daughter is preparing paperwork to have you declared legally unable to manage your own affairs. I didn't say anything for a long time. Ruth Callahan's Belova sat on the felt pad in front of me, its little cracked face catching the afternoon light, and I remember thinking absurdly that I needed to finish that repair by Friday because she'd asked to wear it to her granddaughter's graduation. That doesn't make sense, I finally said. I run a business, Dale. I do my own taxes. I balance my own books. Nobody who's met me for 5 minutes would sign off on something like that. I know, Dale said. That's what scares me. Somebody's building a case anyway. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment because I think it's the part of this story people understand least. I didn't feel rage. Rage would come later. And even then it never burned the way you'd expect. What I felt first was something closer to the sensation of standing on a floor you trusted your whole life and feeling it flex just slightly, just enough to remind you that nothing holds you up except its own construction, and construction can be undone. I thought about Emily at 7 years old, missing her front teeth, insisting on wearing her mother's old wristwatch to school, even though it was 3 sizes too big, and slid halfway up her forearm all day. I thought about her at 14, the year Margaret died, sitting on the floor of the shop after hours doing her homework, because she said the house felt too quiet without her mother in it. And I let her, every single night for almost 2 years, even though it meant I couldn't close up until 9. I thought about the $22,000 I'd taken out against the shop, the building my own father had built, to help with her wedding, money I hadn't told her I'd had to remortgage to raise, because I never wanted her carrying that weight. And I thought about the fact that somewhere, in an office in Montpelier, a stranger with a law degree was putting my name on paper next to the word incapacity. I didn't call Emily that night. I want you to understand why, because I think it's the truest thing I can tell you about who I was before all of this happened. I didn't call her because some part of me, the part that had spent 55 years finding reasons to forgive people before they'd even finished disappointing me, was already building her a defense in my head. She's stressed about the wedding. Preston's family pressures her. Maybe it's not what it looks like. Maybe there's an explanation that doesn't require me to believe my own daughter is preparing to take my life away from me on paper. That's the thing nobody warns you about. When it comes to loving your children past the point where loving them stops being safe, you don't stop making excuses for them just because the evidence stops making sense. You get better at it. You get faster. By the time Dale hung up the phone that day, I had already half convinced myself the whole thing was a misunderstanding, and I went to bed that night in the little house above my shop, the same house I'd raised Emily in alone, and I lay there in the dark telling myself a story I badly wanted to be true. I wasn't ready to stop telling myself that story yet. It would take one more thing to break it. That thing arrived 2 days later, and it didn't come from Dale, and it didn't come from a lawyer's office. It came from Preston's younger sister, a 19-year-old girl named Ophelia Ashford, who I had met exactly once, at a family dinner 3 months earlier, and who had spent that entire evening saying almost nothing at all, watching everyone at that table with the careful, quiet attention of someone who noticed far more than she let on. She called my shop on a Thursday afternoon, when I was alone closing register, and her voice on the phone was shaking in a way that made me sit down before she'd said more than my name. "Mr. Hutchins," she said, "I probably shouldn't be calling you. But I heard my father talking to Preston last night, and I don't think anyone was supposed to hear it. And I keep thinking about it, and I don't know what else to do except tell you. I asked her, as gently as I could, what she'd heard. They were talking about your building, Ophelia said. My dad's company needs it. There's a whole redevelopment plan for that block, a boutique hotel, something big, and your corner lot is the one piece they don't own yet. And my dad said, she stopped, and I heard her take a breath on the other end of the line, the kind of breath you take before you say something you know will change everything. He said Emily was the easiest way in. He said all she had to do was get you declared incompetent, and the property would go into a conservatorship, and he'd already promised to make Preston and Emily's wedding debt disappear if she got it done before the ceremony. I sat in my shop for a long time after that call ended, surrounded by dozens of clocks all ticking at slightly different speeds, the way they always do no matter how carefully you set them, and I understood for the first time that whatever happened at that engagement party in 4 days, it was not going to be the celebration anyone had told me it was going to be. I still went. I want you to understand that too. I put on the only good suit I owned, the one from Margaret's funeral, and I drove 2 hours south to a house with its own name because some stubborn, hopeful part of me still believed that if I stood in that room and looked my daughter in the eye, she would see me, really see me, and whatever was happening would stop before it started. I had no idea, walking through those doors that evening, that in less than an hour I would be standing in front of 200 strangers, being told my suit looked like it belonged to a charity case, or that 10 minutes after that, a black car would pull up outside Thornacrest carrying a man I hadn't seen in 35 years, a man who was about to walk through that same door and change the rest of my life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where I was. That afternoon, 35 years earlier, in a shop that smelled like brass and cedar, when a 15-year-old boy with a broken pocket watch and nowhere else to go pushed open my father's door for the very first time. 35 years ago, I was 29 years old, still learning my father's trade well enough to trust my own hands with anything more delicate than a wall clock. And it was late October, the kind of Vermont evening where the cold comes down fast and mean once the sun drops behind the hills. I was closing up the shop, counting the register, when the bell over the door rang and a boy walked in who couldn't have been older than 15, wearing a jacket too thin for the weather and shoes with the sole starting to separate from the toe on the left foot. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, just inside the doorway, like he wasn't sure the shop would let him stay if he came in any farther. I remember his hands. They were shaking, not from the cold exactly, though the cold didn't help, but the way hands shake when a person has been holding something too tightly for too long and doesn't quite trust themselves to let go of it. "Are you open?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the second word. I told him I was, though it was nearly 6, and my father, who was still alive then and still ran the register most days, had already gone up to the house. I asked him what he needed. He held out his hand, and in it was a pocket watch, the kind of watch that hadn't been fashionable in 50 years, silver-cased, the glass over the face shattered into a spider's web of cracks, the second hand bent almost double where something had struck it. He held it out to me the way you'd hold out something alive and hurt. "It stopped," he said. "I need it to work again. Can you fix it?" I turned it over in my hands. The back of the case had an inscription, worn nearly smooth by decades of handling, but I could still make out a few letters if I tilted it toward the light. "To my son, always." That was all that remained legible. I asked him his name. He hesitated so long I thought he might not answer at all, and then he said, "Ezra." I asked him if the watch belonged to his father. "My mother," he said. "It's the only thing of hers I have left." I didn't ask him what that meant, exactly. Not that first night. There are some questions you learn not to ask a boy standing alone in a doorway in October, with shoes falling apart on his feet. What I did instead was tell him the repair would take a few days, that the mainspring looked bent along with the crystal, and that it wasn't going to be cheap. His face did something then that I've thought about more times over the following 35 years than almost anything else in my life. It didn't fall, exactly, it closed. Like a door somewhere behind his eyes had quietly shut, the way a person's face closes when they've just learned, Again, that the world isn't going to make an exception for them. I don't have money, he said. I just thought, and he didn't finish the sentence. He reached to take the watch back. I don't fully know, even now, what made me do what I did next. Maybe it was my own father's voice in my head. The same father who'd told me at 9 years old that fixing tiny gears was women's work, and some part of me that had spent 20 years proving him wrong wanted, just once, to prove something different to somebody who needed it proven. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe I just looked at that boy's shoes and thought about how cold it was going to get that night. Tell you what, I said. I could use some help sweeping up around here after school. You come by a few afternoons, help me out, we'll call the watch even. He looked at me like he was waiting for the trick. I understand now, better than I did then, why he'd have expected one, but there wasn't a trick. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and by the end of that week I'd learned, in pieces, the shape of what had brought him to my door. His mother had died the year before, cancer, same as Margaret would, decades later. Though I didn't know that yet, of course, back then. His father had never been in the picture. He'd been placed with an aunt 2 towns over who mostly forgot he existed, except when the state check arrived. And somewhere in the last year he'd started staying away from her house, more nights than he stayed in it, sleeping in a friend's garage, or behind the diner where the cook let him have the leftover soup at closing if he didn't make a habit of asking. I fixed his mother's watch free of charge, in the end, though I never told him that. I told him the sweeping had covered it, and I made sure he swept a lot that autumn, and some winter, and into the spring, long after the watch itself was back on its little chain in his coat pocket, ticking steady again. I taught him things nobody had bothered teaching him. How to hold a loop without straining your eye, how to be patient with something small and broken instead of forcing it, how a mainspring, wound too tight and too fast, will snap clean through, but wound slow and careful, will hold for 100 years. He asked me once that winter, sitting on the stool by the workbench with a cup of hot cider I'd made him drink whether he wanted it or not, why I bothered. Why I let him keep coming back. Why I fed him and taught him and never once, not once, asked him for anything in return that mattered. I told him something my father never told me, something I'd had to learn on my own, the hard way, and I've never forgotten the exact words because I've said them to myself 1,000 times since, in 1,000 different rooms. Because you're not broken, I told him. You're just stopped. There's a difference. Broken things you throw away. Stop things, you wind back up, and they run again just fine. He left the following spring. He didn't say goodbye, not exactly. Not the way you plan a goodbye. He came by the shop one Saturday. Told me his aunt was moving out of state and he'd decided to go with a cousin instead down south to try something different, and he thanked me for the watch and for the cider and for the sweeping money, though we both knew by then there'd never been sweeping money worth what he'd earned. I gave him $20 from the till that I told him was back pay. It wasn't. He knew it wasn't. He took it anyway, because I think by then we'd both learned that some kindnesses only work if you let the other person pretend they're something smaller than they are. I never saw him again. I thought about him, over the years, more than you might expect for a boy I'd known less than a year, decades ago. I wondered sometimes, late at night, whether he'd made it wherever he was going. I never learned his last name. I never had a way to find him even if I'd wanted to. He became, over 3.5 decades, a small warm memory I kept tucked somewhere in the back of my chest, the kind of memory that doesn't ache exactly, just sits there, gently, reminding you that once you did one thing right. I had no idea, sitting in that shop all those years, that Ezra had grown into a name half the country would eventually recognize. I don't follow business news. I don't own a smartphone that does much more than call and text. I had never once, in 35 years, connected the boy with the broken pocket watch to the headlines about a company called Meridian Horologics, a firm that had built its entire brand, its billion-dollar valuation, its factories, its name, on the idea that mechanical craftsmanship deserved a second life in a digital age. I didn't know that its founder, a man named Ezra Colt, had spent the better part of 2 decades telling interviewers, whenever they asked about his inspiration, some version of the same story, that a stranger had once taught him that stopped things aren't broken things, and that the lesson had built his entire company from the ground up. I didn't know any of that. Walking into Thornycrest on the night of my daughter's engagement party, wearing my dead wife's funeral suit, carrying a folded piece of paper in my inside jacket pocket that I hadn't told anyone about yet. Not even Dale. Let me tell you about that paper because it matters to what happened next. 2 nights before the party, unable to sleep, I'd gone down to the shop in the dark and pulled a small metal box out from beneath a loose floorboard behind the workbench, a hiding place my father had built decades earlier for exactly the kind of thing you don't want anyone stumbling across by accident. Inside that box, along with my father's old army medal and Margaret's wedding ring, which I'd never been able to sell no matter how bad things got, was a folded note, yellowed at the edges, that a 15-year-old boy had left on my workbench the morning he left town for good, tucked under a spool of watch chain where he knew I'd find it. I had never shown that note to anyone. Not Margaret. Not Emily. I hadn't even reread it myself more than a handful of times over 35 years. Because reading it did something to my chest I never fully knew how to handle. I brought it with me to that party anyway, folded small in my jacket pocket, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. Some instinct, maybe. The same instinct that makes you bring an umbrella on a day the sky looks fine. The drive down to Burlington took just under 2 hours. Emily had texted me the address twice, as though she thought I might get lost, and a third time to remind me, gently but pointedly, that it was black tie, that I should wear something nice. And I remember sitting in my truck outside my own shop before I left, looking down at the only suit I owned that qualified as nice, and feeling something in my chest tighten that I couldn't name yet. Thornycrest, when I arrived, looked less like a house and more like something out of a film about people who'd never worried about a heating bill in their lives. String lights wound through the branches of trees that had probably been on that property longer than the state of Vermont had been a state. A white tent, big enough to hold a small church congregation, glowed gold from within, and even from the driveway I could hear the low murmur of 200 conversations happening at once, punctuated by the thin, bright notes of a string quartet working its way through something classical and forgettable. A valet in a uniform nicer than my suit took my truck keys with an expression he was careful, professionally, not to let show anything. I walked toward that tent alone, the way I've walked into most rooms in my life since Margaret died, and I found Emily near the entrance, radiant in a pale blue dress that must have cost more than my truck, standing beside Preston, who was shaking hands with a rotation of guests like a man running for office. "Dad," Emily said, and hugged me. Quick, the kind of hug you give someone when your attention is already moving past them to the next thing. "You made it. You look," she paused, just slightly, just long enough that I felt it. "You look nice." I want to tell you I didn't notice the pause. I noticed it. I've spent 41 years training my hands to feel the difference between a gear that's slightly off its axis and one that's seated true, and I felt that same small, precise wrongness in my daughter's voice, though I told myself, again, that I was imagining it, that I was tired from the drive, that this was supposed to be a happy night, and I was choosing to ruin it with suspicion. Preston shook my hand with the particular firmness of a man who'd been coached on handshakes. "Walter," he said, "glad you could make it out. Traffic wasn't too bad, I hope, coming down from—" He paused, the exact same pause Emily had made. "Up there." I told him the traffic had been fine. For the first half hour, I stood near the edges of things, the way I always do at gatherings like that, nursing a club soda because I've never much cared for the taste of the champagne. Everyone else seemed to be drinking, and I watched my daughter move through that tent like she'd been born to it, laughing at jokes I couldn't hear, touching elbows, tossing her head back in a way I recognized from her mother and hadn't seen her do in years. For a little while watching her, I let myself feel something close to happy. She looked like she belonged. Fathers want that for their daughters, whatever it costs them to watch it happen. It was somewhere around the 90-minute mark, standing near a long table of hors d'oeuvres I didn't recognize the names of, that Bradford Ashford found me. I'd met him only twice before, both times briefly, And both times he'd looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you've inherited and haven't decided yet whether to keep. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the kind of tan that comes from somewhere expensive rather than a Vermont summer. And when he approached me that night, he had a woman on his arm I didn't recognize, younger than him by at least 2 decades, introduced only as Vivian, a name he said the way some men say the names of very good investments. Walter, Bradford said, glad you made the trip. Vivian was just asking me about small-town Vermont businesses. I told her you run a little shop up in Ashbury, is it? Ashbury Falls, I said. Right, he said, in a tone that suggested the correction hadn't mattered at all. Watches, isn't it? Quaint. There's something to be said for that old-fashioned charm. He said the word charm, the way you'd describe a stray dog you found sort of endearing, but had no intention of feeding. I didn't say much in response. I've learned, over the years, that men like Bradford Ashford aren't actually asking you a question when they talk to you like that. They're performing a kind of conversation for whoever's standing nearby, and your job, if you're the person they've chosen to perform on, is mostly just to stand there and let it happen. It was Vivian who said it, actually, not Preston. I want to correct that for the record, because in the version of this story people have shared and reshared since, they've gotten that detail wrong more times than I can count. It wasn't Preston. He was standing right there, laughing. But the words themselves came from Vivian, holding a champagne flute loosely by its stem, looking me over with the frank, unbothered curiosity of someone assessing a piece of art she didn't understand the appeal of. Is that suit from a thrift store? She said. Not unkindly exactly. More like she was making an observation about the weather. I didn't realize we were letting in charity cases tonight. And there it was. For 3 full seconds, nobody in that ballroom moved. The quartet kept playing. A waiter froze mid-step with a tray of champagne flutes tilting dangerously in his hand. I felt my own hands begin their old, familiar tremble, and I pressed them flat against my thighs, the way I had since I was 9 years old. And I looked for Emily across that tent, some instinct in me still hoping, even then, that she'd cross the floor and put herself between me and that comment, the way I'd put myself between her and every hard thing life had ever thrown at her since she was 14 years old. She didn't move. She stood beside Preston, her face doing something complicated and pained that I didn't have time to fully read, because that was the exact moment the tent's entrance flap pulled back, and a hush moved through the crowd like weather, starting near the door and rolling outward, and I turned, along with everyone else, to see what had caused it. A man in a dark coat had just walked in, flanked by 2 others who kept a careful, deferential half-step behind him, and I watched Bradford Ashford's entire posture change in an instant, his shoulders straightening, his smile snapping into place like a man preparing for the most important handshake of his life. That's Ezra Colt. I heard someone whisper nearby, the name passing through the crowd in a wave of hushed excitement. Meridian Horologics. He's worth more than this entire county. I didn't recognize the name. I want to be honest about that. 35 years is a long time, and the boy I remembered had been 15 years old, thin, cold, with shoes falling apart on his feet, not a man in a tailored coat, commanding the attention of every person in a tent full of the wealthiest people in 3 states. What I did recognize, from clear across that room, before he'd said a single word, before anyone had introduced him to anyone, was the way his eyes moved across the crowd, searching the exact careful, hopeful, guarded way a 15-year-old boy's eyes had once moved across my father's shop on a cold October evening, looking for something he wasn't sure he was allowed to hope for. And then his eyes found me, standing alone near the hors d'oeuvres table in my dead wife's funeral suit, hands trembling against my thighs. And everything about his face changed at once. He crossed that entire tent without stopping for a single one of the 200 guests who'd spent the last hour hoping to catch his attention. He walked straight past Bradford Ashford's outstretched hand. He walked straight past my daughter and her fiancé, who both stepped back, confused, as he moved by them. He stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could see, up close, that this powerful stranger's eyes had gone bright and wet. And for a moment neither of us said anything at all. Then he said my name quiet, almost like he was afraid saying it too loud might make the whole moment disappear. Walter. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. My hands had gone still, for the first time in a very long time, in a crowded room. You don't recognize me, he said. And it wasn't quite a question. I looked at him, really looked, past the tailored coat and the silver watch on his wrist that I'd bet everything I owned had a mechanical movement inside it, and somewhere underneath all of it I found the boy. Still there, still 15, still holding his mother's broken watch out to a stranger with shaking hands. Ezra, I said. He nodded once, and then, in front of 200 of the wealthiest people in 3 states, in front of Bradford Ashford's frozen, uncomprehending face, in front of my daughter and the man she was about to marry, Ezra Colt stepped forward and wrapped both arms around me, and held on the way you hold on to something you were afraid you'd lost for good. You're the reason I'm alive, he said into my shoulder, quiet enough that maybe only I could hear it. You're my father in every way that ever mattered. I want to tell you what happened in that tent over the next several minutes. The stunned silence, the whispers spreading outward like ripples on water, the particular look on Bradford Ashford's face as he realized, in real time, exactly whose good graces he'd need if his empire was going to survive the next few years. I want to tell you about the look on my daughter's face, caught somewhere between shock and shame, and something else I couldn't name yet. But before I get to any of that, I think you deserve to understand what happened after. Once the shock wore off and the whispers turned into questions, once Ezra Colt asked, in front of everyone, whether he could speak to me privately. And once I found myself sitting with him an hour later on the back terrace of a house I didn't belong in, hearing for the first time exactly how far he'd gone over the years trying to find me, and exactly what he already knew about the guardianship papers quietly being drafted with my name on them, because Ezra Colt hadn't walked into that party by accident. And what he told me next changed everything I thought I understood about who was really behind what was happening to me. The terrace behind Thornycrest overlooked a stretch of lawn that rolled down toward a dark tree line, and somewhere out there an owl was calling, patient and unbothered by everything happening inside that tent. Ezra had asked one of his security men to give us the space, and for a while neither of us said anything at all. We just sat there, 2 men on a stone bench built for people who'd never worried about the cost of stone, listening to that owl, and I found myself doing something I hadn't done in a very long time in front of another person. I let my hands shake, openly, without trying to hide it, and Ezra noticed, and reached over and simply put his hand over mine until it stopped. I looked for you, he finally said. For years. I didn't know your last name until I was 23. I remembered the shop. I remembered the street, but Ashbury Falls doesn't exactly show up on many maps, and back then I didn't have the money to go looking properly. By the time I did have the money, the trail had gone cold in the ways trails go cold. Business records from a town that's small don't always survive changes in ownership or software systems or fires in county courthouses. I hired investigators 3 separate times over about 15 years. Each time, they came back with nothing solid enough to act on. I told him the shop had never changed hands. I told him I was right there the whole time, 40 minutes up the highway, fixing watches at the same counter my father had stood behind. I know that now, Ezra said, and something tightened in his jaw. I found out 2 weeks ago, not from an investigator. From Bradford Ashford's own office, actually, which is the part I need to tell you about, because I don't think you understand yet what you've walked into tonight. I felt that old cold tightness return to my stomach. Meridian's been in early conversations with Ashford Development for the better part of a year, Ezra said. Bradford's been courting us as an anchor tenant for a mixed-use redevelopment he's planning in downtown Burlington, and apparently in a few smaller towns nearby, including one called Ashbury Falls. 2 weeks ago, his office sent over a due diligence packet for the project, standard stuff, property surveys, acquisition timelines, projected parcel closings. My legal team flagged one of the properties on the list because the current owner of record had the same last name I'd been searching for my entire adult life. My shop, I said. Your shop, he confirmed. Listed as a targeted acquisition. expected closing within 6 months, contingent on what the paperwork called a pending change in property control. He said that last phrase carefully, watching my face. Walter, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, because it matters more than you probably realize right now. Has anyone approached you about a power of attorney, or a guardianship, or anything of the kind? I told him what Dale had learned. I told him about Ophelia's phone call, about the elder law attorney in Montpelier, about the note in my jacket pocket that I still hadn't been able to bring myself to unfold in front of anyone. Ezra listened without interrupting, his expression growing harder and more still with every detail, until I finished and the two of us sat there in the quiet, the owl still calling somewhere in the dark. He's using your daughter, Ezra said finally, and I heard something almost gentle in the way he said it, like he understood exactly what those words were going to cost me to hear. I don't think Emily came up with this on her own, Walter. I think Bradford's been circling your property for the better part of a year, and I think he found the one lever in your life that could get it moved without a fight, and he's been pulling it, quietly, through his son, for months. Why would he need my one small building, I said. He owns half of downtown Burlington already. Because your corner is the last unassembled parcel in a 9-lot footprint he's already committed on paper to a hotel chain, Ezra said. If he can't close on your lot within the timeline in his contract, he loses the entire deal, and from what my finance team has pieced together in the last 2 weeks, Bradford Ashford is in considerably worse financial shape than his reputation suggests. He's leveraged against 3 other projects that haven't performed. If this deal collapses, I don't think Ashford Development survives the year. I sat with that for a long moment. Somewhere in that tent behind us, I could hear the murmur of 200 conversations, all of them, I imagined, now revolving around the strange, unexplained scene that had just played out in front of them. There's something else, Ezra said, and his voice changed slightly, grew quieter, more careful. I don't think Bradford's the only one under pressure here. I had my team look at the financials around Preston and Emily's wedding. Once I connected the dots on the property listing. Walter, your daughter and Preston are carrying debt. A significant amount. Some of it's Preston's credit cards, a failed investment he made 2 years ago that he's never told his father about. Some of it, from what I can tell, is money Emily's quietly put in to try to cover for him, without telling anyone, including you. I thought about the $22,000 I'd remortgaged the shop to give her for the wedding, and I felt something in my chest that I didn't have a clean name for. Not quite anger. Something closer to grief for a version of my daughter. I was starting to understand I'd been protecting in my own mind for longer than she deserved. I'm not telling you this to excuse what's happening, Ezra said. What's being done to you is wrong, no matter what pressure is driving it. But I've learned something, building the kind of company I've built, dealing with the kind of people who circle it. The people doing the worst things are very rarely the ones who came up with the idea. Somebody above them found their weak point and pushed. I think Bradford found Emily's fear of losing everything she's built for herself, her fear of disappointing a family like the Ashfords, and I think he's been pushing on it for months, promising to make Preston's debt disappear the moment your building closes. I asked him then, the question that had been sitting underneath everything else since Dale's first phone call 3 months earlier. I asked him what I was supposed to do. Ezra was quiet for a moment, and then he reached into his coat and drew out a slim leather folder, the kind of understated, expensive thing that men like him seemed to carry everywhere, and set it on the stone bench between us without opening it. Nothing tonight, he said. Tonight, you go back in there, and you let people see exactly what they saw 10 minutes ago. You let Bradford Ashford understand that the man his son's fiancée has been quietly trying to have declared incompetent is the same man an entire company was built to honor. That alone changes the math for him. But tomorrow, if you're willing, I want my legal team to look at everything, the guardianship filing, if there is one yet, the property, everything. Not because I'm trying to fight your battles for you, Walter, because 35 years ago, you fixed a watch for a boy who had nothing to pay you with, and you never once made him feel like that mattered. I've spent my whole career trying to build something worthy of that. Let me actually do something worthy of it. For once, instead of just talking about it in interviews. I didn't answer him right away. I sat there, looking out at that dark tree line, and I thought about the note still folded in my jacket pocket. The one that boy had left under a spool of watch chain 35 years earlier. The one I'd never shown to another living soul. I reached into my pocket and drew it out, and unfolded it carefully. The paper soft and worn at the creases from 3.5 decades of being handled just enough to keep it from disappearing entirely, and I handed it to Ezra without a word. He read it in the low light spilling out from the tent behind us, and I watched his face as he did, watched 35 years fall away from it in real time, until he looked, for just a moment, exactly like the boy who'd written it. The note was short. I'd read it enough times over the years that I knew every word of it by heart, though I let him read it himself, silently, because some things need to be received in a person's own voice, even a voice reading silently. Mr. Hutchins, it said, you told me stopped things aren't broken things. I don't think anyone ever told me anything true before you. I don't know where I'm going, but I'm going to build something someday, and when I do, I'm going to build it the way you taught me to fix things. Slow, careful, like it matters. Thank you for winding me back up. Ezra sat there for a long time after he finished reading it, holding that small piece of paper like it weighed considerably more than paper should weigh. And when he finally looked up at me, his eyes were wet again, the way they'd been the moment he'd first seen me across that crowded tent. I kept every version of the speech I gave about you, he said quietly. Every interview, every graduation talk, every time somebody at Meridian asked why the company philosophy is what it is. I always told them a version of this story, but I never once had your permission, because I never once knew if you were even still alive to give it. I want you to know that before anything else happens tonight, before lawyers get involved, before any of it, this note is the only thing I own that I would run back into a burning building for. I want to tell you that I said something wise in that moment, something that matched the weight of what he'd just told me. Mostly, I just sat there, an old watchmaker in a dead wife's funeral suit, letting a billionaire hold a scrap of paper I'd kept hidden under a floorboard for 35 years, and letting myself, for the first time in longer than I could remember, feel like maybe I hadn't spent my whole life being the kind of man other people set aside. We went back inside together a few minutes later. The party hadn't recovered its earlier rhythm, not entirely. People stood in small clusters, talking in the particular hushed, urgent way people talk when something has happened that they don't yet fully understand but know matters enormously. Bradford Ashford found us almost immediately. His earlier composure only partially reassembled, his smile stretched thin over something that looked, up close, considerably more like fear than warmth. Mr. Colt, he said, I had no idea you two were acquainted. If I'd known, I'd have made proper introductions much earlier in the evening. We're more than acquainted, Ezra said, his voice pleasant, almost light, in a way that somehow made it more unsettling than if he'd been openly hostile. Walter here is the reason Meridian exists at all. I was actually hoping to speak with you about the Ashbury Falls parcel in your redevelopment packet, Bradford. I understand there's some urgency around that particular acquisition. I watched Bradford Ashford's face do something complicated, watched him try to calculate, in real time, exactly how much this stranger who'd just publicly embraced his son's future father-in-law already knew, and I watched him decide, wisely, not to test the boundaries of that uncertainty in front of 200 witnesses. There's flexibility in our timeline, Bradford said carefully. Nothing's finalized. Good, Ezra said. Because I'd hate for Meridian's involvement in your Burlington project to become complicated by anything happening with that particular parcel. We take our anchor partnerships very seriously. Reputation matters enormously to us. I imagine it matters to you too. It wasn't a threat exactly. It didn't need to be. Bradford Ashford understood, standing there in his own backyard, surrounded by 200 guests who all worked in industries that ran on reputation the way engines run on fuel, exactly what Ezra Colt had just told him without saying it outright. I watched something in the older man's posture deflate. Just slightly, the way a tire loses air slowly enough that you don't notice the change until the car starts pulling to one side. Across the tent, I found Emily standing alone near the edge of the dance floor, her champagne untouched, her face pale in a way I hadn't seen since her mother's funeral. Preston stood a short distance away, deep in a tense, quiet conversation with his father, both of their faces doing the particular arithmetic of men who'd suddenly realized the ground beneath their plans had shifted in a way they hadn't accounted for. I walked over to my daughter. For a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. "Dad," she finally said, her voice small in a way I hadn't heard from her since she was a teenager standing in a hospital hallway, waiting for news about her mother that neither of us wanted. "I need to explain. You do," I said. "But not tonight. Tonight, I think we've both had enough surprises for one evening." She nodded, and something in her face crumpled, just slightly. The careful composure she'd worn all evening finally beginning to slip. I didn't stay to watch it fall apart entirely. I want to be honest with you about that too. Some part of me, the part that had spent 34 years making excuses for her before she'd even finished disappointing me, wanted badly to stay, to comfort her, to make the hard thing easier the way I'd made every hard thing easier for her, since she was 14 years old. I didn't. For maybe the first time in my life, I let my daughter sit alone with the weight of what she'd allowed to happen, and I walked out of that tent into the cold October air and found Ezra waiting for me by the cars, and I let him drive me home. Over the following weeks, everything Ezra had promised on that terrace began, slowly and carefully, to unfold. But before I tell you how the guardianship filing collapsed, or how Bradford Ashford's empire began coming apart at the exact moment his hotel deal fell through, or what happened the night Emily finally called me, months later, ready to say the things she hadn't been able to say at that party, I need to tell you about a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the engagement party, when a 19-year-old girl walked into my shop carrying a box she said she'd been keeping for me without knowing why. 3 weeks after the engagement party, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, with rain coming down steady against the front window of my shop, the bell over my door rang, and Ophelia Ashford walked in, carrying a shoebox held against her chest with both arms. The way you carry something you're afraid of dropping. She was still in her school clothes, hair damp from the rain, and she stood just inside the doorway, the way Ezra had stood in that same spot 35 years earlier, uncertain whether she was welcome. "I hope it's okay that I came," she said. "I got your address from Emily's old wedding planning folder. I probably shouldn't have." I told her it was fine, and pulled out the second stool from behind the counter, and she sat, setting the shoebox carefully in her lap. "I've been thinking about what my dad did," she said. "What he's been doing. I couldn't stop thinking about it after that night. So I went through some of his old files, the ones he keeps at the house instead of the office, the ones from before I was born even." She opened the box and drew out a thin stack of papers, yellowed with age, along with what looked like old photographs and a handful of handwritten letters. "These aren't about you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I didn't find some smoking gun with your name on it. These are about my dad, about who he used to be, before he became who he is now. There's a whole box of letters in here from a woman named Vivian, going back almost 15 years. She's not just his girlfriend, Mr. Hutchins. She's been in his life since before my mom left him. I think," Ophelia paused, and I watched her work up the courage to say the next part. "I think she's the one who's been pushing him. There are letters in here about debts she has, about a business of her own that failed years ago, about money my dad's been quietly funneling to her for over a decade. I think the reason he needs the Burlington deal to close so badly isn't just his own company's finances. I think it's partly hers. I think she's the one who's been telling him for years that he needs to be bigger, richer, more important. And I think somewhere along the way he stopped being able to tell the difference between what he wanted and what she wanted from him." I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way I'd turn over an unfamiliar mechanism, trying to understand how the gears fit together. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked her gently. "Because everyone thinks my dad is the villain in this," she said, and her voice cracked slightly. "And maybe he is. He did a terrible thing to you and to Emily, but I don't think he came up with it on his own, not really. I think somebody's been pulling on him for a long time, the same way you told me he was pulling on Emily. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I just know I couldn't keep pretending I didn't see it. I thanked her and told her she'd done something brave, bringing that box to a stranger's watch shop on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. And she left a little while later looking, I thought, lighter than she'd looked walking in, the way people often do after they've finally set down something they've been carrying alone for too long. I called Ezra that evening and told him what Ophelia had shown me. He was quiet on the line for a long moment. That matches what my team's been finding, he said. Bradford's finances have been bleeding for years, longer than just this one deal. If there's someone behind him pushing for more, faster, at any cost, that would explain a lot of decisions that never made sense on paper. Walter, I don't say this to excuse what he's done, but it changes how I want to handle this. I don't want to destroy a man who's being used as badly as your daughter's been used. I want the truth out, and I want your property and your name protected. And I want it done in a way that gives everyone involved a chance to actually reckon with what they've done instead of just getting crushed by it. What happened over the following 6 weeks moved faster than I ever expected anything involving lawyers to move. Ezra's legal team discovered the guardianship petition had never actually been filed with the court, only drafted and sitting in the Montpelier attorney's office awaiting Emily's signature, a detail that mattered more to me than I expected it to when Dale finally confirmed it. My daughter had come within a signature of taking my independence from me on paper, but she hadn't crossed that final line, not yet. And some part of me held on to that distinction, the way you hold on to the last intact gear in a mechanism that's otherwise stripped bare. Meridian's legal and communications teams moved quietly at first, then not quietly at all. Ezra withdrew, publicly and formally, from any consideration of Ashford Development as an anchor partner for the Burlington project, citing what his company's statement called concerns about the ethical conduct of Ashford leadership. It was a careful sentence, but everyone in that industry understood exactly what it meant, and within 2 weeks, 3 other investors who'd been circling the same deal quietly withdrew as well. The hotel chain that had signed a contingent agreement with Bradford Ashford exercised an exit clause. Without Meridian's anchor commitment, without my corner lot, the entire 9-parcel redevelopment fell apart within a month, and along with it went the financing for 2 other Ashford development projects that had been leveraged against its success. I want to tell you I felt triumphant, watching that empire come apart from a distance. Mostly what I felt was tired, and a little sad in the particular way you feel sad watching something collapse even when you know it deserved to. Emily called me 4 times in those first 2 weeks. I didn't answer any of them. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't punishment, not exactly, though I understand if it looked that way from the outside. I simply didn't trust my own voice yet. I didn't trust that if I picked up that phone, I wouldn't slide right back into the old habit of forgiving her before she'd even finished explaining herself. And some part of me, some new, unfamiliar part that had been growing quietly since that night on Ezra's terrace, understood that I needed to sit with the hurt a little longer before I let myself set it down. The wedding, as you might imagine, did not go forward as planned. What happened instead, 3 weeks after the deal collapsed, was a smaller gathering, a rehearsal dinner that had somehow survived the wreckage of everything around it, held at a restaurant in Burlington that Preston's family had booked months earlier, and apparently hadn't been able to cancel in time. I only learned about it because Emily's assistant, in a moment of what I can only assume was confusion about the state of things, sent me the original invitation reminder, and something in me decided, almost against my own better judgment, to go. I sat near the back of that restaurant, in a room considerably smaller and quieter than the tent at Thornycrest had been, watching my daughter sit beside a man whose family's entire fortune was crumbling around them in real time, both of them wearing the particular strained smiles of people trying to hold together an occasion that had already, in every way that mattered, come apart. Bradford Ashford stood to give a toast partway through the dinner, his voice noticeably thinner than it had been at the engagement party, his composure fraying at the edges in a way that made me feel unexpectedly a flicker of pity for him. He spoke for a while about family, about legacy, about the values that built Ashford Development, and I watched Ophelia, sitting 2 seats down from him, grow more and more rigid as he spoke, her hands folded tightly in her lap. And of course, Bradford said, his voice catching slightly, we've all had a difficult few weeks, watching outside forces try to interfere with what our families built. I won't dwell on that tonight. Tonight is about Preston and Emily, and about the kind of life they're going to build together, the kind our family has always. Stop, Ophelia said. She said it quietly, but the whole room heard it, the way you hear a single dropped fork in an otherwise silent house. She stood, her chair scraping back against the floor, and for a moment her father simply stared at her, uncomprehending, as though his own daughter interrupting his toast wasn't a category of event he'd ever prepared for. You're standing up here talking about legacy, Ophelia said, her voice shaking but clear, and everyone in this room knows exactly what our family's legacy almost cost that man. She pointed, and I felt every head in that restaurant turn toward the back table where I sat, alone, in my ordinary clothes. Having come to a rehearsal dinner nobody had actually expected me to attend. You tried to take his home, Dad. You tried to take his independence, his dignity, everything he spent his entire life building, because your business needed a corner lot, and you didn't think a small-town watchmaker was important enough to matter. And you used Emily to do it, the same way you've used everyone in this family, for years to get what you want. I'm done pretending I don't see that. I'm done being quiet about it because it's easier than watching you get uncomfortable at dinner. The silence that followed was different from the silence at Thornycrest. That silence had been shock. This silence was recognition, the particular hush of a room full of people who'd all secretly known something for a long time, and were finally hearing it said out loud. Bradford Ashford sat back down without finishing his toast. I don't think he said another word for the rest of that dinner. It was around then, in the awkward, unraveling quiet that followed, that a small voice cut through the room, belonging to a boy of about 6, Preston's cousin's son, who I later learned had been dragged along to the dinner and left largely to his own devices at a table near the back. He'd apparently wandered close enough to hear most of what had just happened, and he tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, in the clear, unfiltered way only children manage, a question that landed harder in that room than anything Ophelia had said. Mommy, he said, why is everybody mad at the nice man? He fixed Grandpa's watch for free that one time when we didn't have any money for it. Grandpa said he's the kindest man he ever met. I hadn't known that story. I didn't recognize the boy, or connect him to any customer I could place by name. But somewhere in 41 years of running that shop, I'd apparently fixed a watch for free for somebody's grandfather, some ordinary act of kindness I'd long since forgotten, and it had traveled, unnoticed by me, all the way to a 6-year-old boy at a rehearsal dinner in Burlington, and it landed in that room like the truest thing anyone had said all evening. I stood up, then, not entirely sure what I meant to do, and found Emily's eyes across the room, and for the first time since that night at Thornycrest, I saw something in her face that wasn't shame or fear or careful management. I saw, I think, the beginning of actually seeing me, the way a person sees another person instead of a problem to be handled. I didn't stay much longer after that. I told the room, briefly, that I appreciated Ophelia's courage, and that I hoped whatever came next for all of them, they found their way to something true. And then I left, and drove back up the highway to Ashbury Falls, alone, the way I'd driven home from most difficult things in my life. What I didn't expect, pulling into my own driveway a little before 10 that night, was to find nearly 24 people gathered outside my darkened shop, standing quietly on the sidewalk in the cold, holding candles and small handwritten signs. None of them shouting or making a scene, just standing there, waiting, the way you wait for someone you care about to come home. Word travels fast in a town of 6,000 people, especially when it involves a story as strange as a billionaire calling the local watchmaker his father at a society party, 2 towns over. Ruth Callahan was there, the woman whose late husband's Belova I'd repaired months earlier, holding it up on her wrist so I could see it still ticking. Dale was there. A dozen other faces I recognized from decades of counter-transactions, people whose watches I'd fixed, whose clocks I'd wound, whose small broken things I'd spent 41 years quietly putting back together, without ever once thinking of it as anything more than my ordinary work. Nobody had organized it. Nobody had asked them to come. They simply stood there, in the cold, holding their candles, and when I climbed out of my truck, none of them cheered or made a fuss. They just made room for me to walk through, a few of them reaching out to touch my shoulder as I passed. And Ruth Callahan said, quietly, "We just wanted you to know somebody was here." And I found, standing on my own sidewalk in front of my own shop, that I couldn't speak at all for a long moment, and nobody seemed to mind waiting for me to find my voice again. The second climax of this story, the part I think about most often when I tell it, didn't happen at any courtroom or any collapsed business deal. It happened 6 weeks later, at a small ceremony Ezra insisted on holding at the shop itself, on a cold, clear Saturday morning in December, with maybe 30 people gathered on Maple Street, watching him unveil a modest brass plaque beside my front door. It read simply, "The Hutchins Fellowship for Craft and Patience, established by Meridian Horologics, in honor of Walter Hutchins, who taught a stranger that stopped things aren't broken things." Ezra had set up a small fund, modest by his own company's standards, but larger than anything Ashbury Falls had seen before, to sponsor apprenticeships for young people in trades like mine, watchmaking, clockmaking, the kind of patient, careful work that doesn't get much attention in a world that mostly wants things fast and disposable. He asked me to say a few words that morning, and I stood on the sidewalk outside my own shop, in front of the same building my father had built in 1958, and I found myself, without planning it, reaching into my jacket pocket and drawing out that same folded note, worn soft at its creases, and reading it aloud, for the first time in 35 years, to a small crowd gathered in the cold. "Mr. Hutchins, you told me stopped things aren't broken things. I don't think anyone ever told me anything true before you." I watched more than one person in that crowd wipe their eyes. I watched Ophelia, who'd come up from Burlington for the ceremony, standing near the back with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, nodding along like she already knew every word. Emily wasn't there that morning. I want to be honest about that too, because I think this story only means something if I tell you the parts that didn't resolve as neatly as the parts that did. It would be 4 more months before I heard from her in a way that felt real, 4 months of silence I let stretch out because I needed it to. 4 months during which I learned much later she'd quietly ended things with Preston, moved out of the apartment they'd shared, and started seeing a counselor in Burlington who specialized, of all things, in family estrangement. The call finally came on a Tuesday evening in April, while I was halfway through a plate of reheated stew, watching the last of the winter light fade over the hills outside my kitchen window. "The caller ID," said Emily, and I sat there for a long moment, staring at it, before I finally picked up. "Hi, Dad," she said, and her voice sounded different than I remembered it sounding in a long time. Smaller, maybe, or maybe just more honest. We talked for a while about nothing important, the way people do when they're circling something too heavy to approach directly, and then, eventually, she took a breath I could hear clearly through the phone and said the thing I think she'd been working up the courage to say for months. "I stopped seeing you as my dad somewhere along the way," she said. "I started seeing you as a problem, a liability, something that stood between me and the life I thought I was supposed to want. I told myself I was being practical. Preston's family made me feel like being practical was the same thing as being smart, and I let that feeling grow until I couldn't tell the difference anymore between protecting my future and destroying yours. I told her I understood, and that I'd needed the months of silence to be able to say that and mean it. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight," she said. "I don't think I've earned that yet. I just needed you to know that I see it now, all of it. What I almost did to you. What I let myself become for a man and a family that never actually respected either of us." We talked for almost an hour that night, longer than we'd talked in years, and somewhere in the middle of it, she asked me, quietly, whether I thought we could ever get back to something like what we used to have. Before the phone calls got shorter and the visits got fewer, and the questions about my finances started sounding less like curiosity and more like reconnaissance, I told her the truth, because I think by then I owed her the truth more than I owed her comfort. You never lost your father, I said. I've been right here the whole time, but my life was never yours to manage, Emily. It never will be. If we're going to find our way back to each other, it has to start there. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, simply, I understand now. And something in the way she said it told me she meant it, all the way down. In a manner the old Emily, the one performing composure at engagement parties, never quite managed. We didn't fix everything in that one phone call. I don't believe things like that get fixed all at once, no matter how badly you want them to. Trust, I've learned, takes considerably longer to rebuild than it takes to lose. The same way a mainspring wound too fast will snap clean through, while one wound slow and careful can hold for 100 years. But it was a beginning, and beginnings, I've come to believe, matter more than people give them credit for. It's been almost a year now since that night at Thornycrest. My shop is still standing on Maple Street, cornerstone and all, protected these days by a small legal trust Ezra insisted on setting up, one that ensures no future redevelopment scheme can ever put my name and the word incapacity in the same sentence again without my knowledge. Emily and I have dinner together most Sundays now, careful, ordinary dinners, the kind where we're both still learning how to talk to each other honestly after years of not quite managing it. Ophelia visits sometimes too, on her way through town, and last month she told me she's decided to study social work instead of finance, a choice her father, still rebuilding what's left of his company from a much smaller office than the one he used to occupy, has apparently struggled to understand. Ezra calls every few weeks, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to check in on the fellowship program, which has already brought 3 young apprentices through my shop this year, teaching them the same patient, careful things I once taught a 15-year-old boy with a broken pocket watch and nowhere else to go. Last week, one of them, a 17-year-old girl named Priya who'd never held a jeweler's loupe before September, fixed her first watch entirely on her own, a small Timex belonging to her grandmother, and I watched her face do the thing every apprentice's face does the first time something they thought was broken starts ticking again in their own hands, and I thought, not for the first time, about how much of a life can circle back around if you're patient enough to let it. A few weeks ago, I wore that same old funeral suit to a small dinner Ezra hosted at the shop, celebrating the fellowship program's first full year, and I noticed him watching me across the room at one point, a small, knowing smile on his face. Still the same suit, he said when I caught his eye. Still works fine, I told him. Nothing wrong with it that needed fixing. He laughed and raised his glass, and something in that small, ordinary exchange felt like the truest ending this story could have. Not the collapse of an empire, though that happened. Not the public embrace in a tent full of strangers, though I'll never forget it. Just an old man in a cheap suit that still fit him fine, standing in the shop his father built, surrounded by people who'd finally learned to see him clearly. I think about that engagement party often. The woman's voice asking whether my suit came from a thrift store, the silence that followed, the way an entire room decided in that moment that I was something small and disposable. I've come to believe there's a kind of quiet revenge in simply refusing to become what people decide you are when they've stopped looking closely enough to see you. You don't have to shout. You don't have to burn anything down yourself. Sometimes you just have to keep standing exactly where you've always stood, patient and unbothered, and let the people who misjudged you watch, in their own time, everything they built on that misjudgment come apart on its own. You can love your family completely and still refuse to let them dismantle you. Those two things have never been opposites, not really. Most days now, I believe they're partners. If you've ever been the one everyone underestimated, the quiet one, the unimpressive one, the person other people decided wasn't worth their attention until circumstances forced them to look again. I hope this story reminds you that being overlooked was never the same thing as being small. And if you've lived through something like this yourself, I genuinely love to hear about it. Sometimes the stories we share are exactly what somebody else needs to find their own courage.